Like monoliths that mark an ancient world, the bunkers, the pillboxes of Flanders, bring us to the ground where the Great War was fought around Ypres. What can we find of them on the landscape today? The Great War has more than a few iconic symbols of that conflict. Things like gas masks, rhomboid-shaped tanks, and the zigzag of trenches and the curl of barbed wire. But also, I think, concrete bunkers. When we imagine a battlefield, a landscape, for example, of the Western Front, we imagine those trenches and the shell holes and the stunted trees, and amongst them, the concrete structures, defensive points so often written about, spoken about in the accounts of the fighting in places, particularly places like Ypres in Flanders. And it's those concrete bunkers, the pillboxes of Flanders, that we'll look at in this podcast. When I first went to Ypres in 1982, I had in the back of my mind probably a list of things that I expected to see, given that I'd read, even by then as a teenager, so much about the Great War and been so heavily influenced by popular culture of the Great War, including the comic strip Charlie's War. And on that list were bunkers. So at the time, it wasn't as much of a surprise to me to see so many of them. And that first trip was a school trip, and our teachers, one of whom was totally obsessed with the Great War, took us to some of the bunkers that were well off the beaten path. I mean, there were so few visitors to the battlefields in the early 1980s anyway, but they had found some locations themselves. And they took us, for example, to some bunkers out in the fields close to St. Julien. And when I saw those, and then later the bunkers in Tyne-Cot, I was probably surprised at the size of them, really. Perhaps I'd thought that bunkers were somehow nestled in the side of a trench, and of course, as we'll discover, there were those type of bunkers. But these were quite sizable concrete structures. But much to my disappointment then, as a teenager, I couldn't get in those bunkers. They were sealed up, or the entrances were covered over. But our teachers took us to Kroonart Wood, known today by its proper wartime name as Bayenwald, at least to the Germans, but then it was a private trench museum with some reconstructed trenches and several original concrete bunkers which you could crawl inside or walk inside. So finally I was able to get into one of these pillboxes. And then we discovered on that trip as well that it wasn't just the Germans that were constructing bunkers. The British, the Commonwealth forces, were doing it as well, and we discovered that, as so many people do, on Hill 60, with the observation bunker there that was built by the Australian engineers on top of an existing German structure to give them an observation post for the artillery in early 1918. So it was clear to me even then on that very first trip that bunkers, pillboxes, were indeed an essential part of what the Great War was all about. And this was further reinforced by the acquisition of a little green guidebook that you could pick up in those days, which I think was only about 90 Belgian francs, which was only just over £1 in those days. A little green guidebook, tucked in it a detailed coloured map that folded out, showed the frontline area, showed where the cemeteries and memorials were, but also showed with little black marks where pillboxes were located. So a kind of a journey began then for me on later trips to seek out those locations and see what was left and what type of pillbox was on those locations. And I discovered that each one I went to was different. There were hardly any in that area around Ypres designs that were repeated on a kind of grand scale. This wasn't like the Atlantic Wall, where they were constructing the same kinds of bunkers right along that coastline, those thousands of kilometres from the Low Country right down to southern France. Although these defences in that context of the Great War were arguably just as strong, they were different in all sorts of ways, and it showed that walking the ground, seeking things out, was a vital part of any kind of research when it came to understanding and connecting with these battlefields. Now, I thought that the authors of that little green guidebook, which was in multiple languages, English, pretty sure French, but certainly Flemish. It was called Ypres in the front streak, Ypres on the front line, and I'm pretty sure it was written by Dr. Cairnapple, who was a great friend of Rose Coombs, who wrote Before Endeavours Fade. I kind of thought that they'd invented this idea of a map, but what I found was that they'd based the idea for the map and the contents of the map on some earlier ones, the Ypres League map of the Ypres salient, and in terms of the data for the pillboxes, they'd used a map that was contained in an interwar publication that I had no idea even existed at that point, which was called The Pillboxes of Flanders by Colonel E.G.L. Thurlow, DSO, which was published in 1933 for the British Legion. This is a small little blue-grey covered book with an image of the Alberta bunker near St Julian, near Kitchener's Wood, on the cover, and then 48 pages of information and ways to visit bunkers, and most importantly, that colour map with details of the areas where you could find the most bunkers. And I'll put a little extract from that map onto the podcast website so you can see it. And also, I'll put the book in the book recommendations on the website page. The original is difficult to find and quite expensive, but there are reprints of it, so you can get hold of the publication. So I'll put details of that on there as well. But who was Colonel Thurlow? Edward Guy Lethbridge Thurlow was a regular soldier. He was commissioned into the Somerset Light Infantry. He was a captain on the outbreak of war, and he became the brigade major of the 22nd Infantry Brigade, part of the 7th Division, that landed at Zeebrugge in October 1914, and he joined them towards the end of the First Battle of Ypres and served for quite some time on the Western Front, becoming a staff officer by the end of the conflict and being awarded the DSO. If Colonel Thurlow wrote his memoirs, they were never published, and I wonder what his fascination with pillboxes were, particularly the pillboxes of Flanders. Perhaps during the fighting of the Great War, he commanded men who came up against these pillboxes, and he saw the effect they could have on the outcome of a battle. But whatever the reason, he's given us one of the earliest guidebooks to some of these concrete structures on the Western Front. And the book is broken up into several sections, really. There are notes on the construction of bunkers. There are notes on how to go and find those bunkers on the landscape of the 1930s. It breaks up the battle area into sectors, so you can go around on mini bunker pillbox tours. And it also lists the cemeteries. Now, the publisher was the British Legion, and perhaps the listing of the cemeteries, which seems a strange thing to do in a guidebook of pillboxes. Perhaps that was part of the deal with the British Legion, to not just make this about structures on the battlefield, but also to help pilgrims visit the war cemeteries. And in that respect, it's a strange little book in some ways, but in good ways too. It includes a couple of little anecdotal stories and extracts that I think give it some colour, and it's one that I'd certainly recommend seeking out, whether in reprint or, if you can afford it, an original copy. In the notes on the construction of bunkers, Thurlow records that the first bunkers that he could find that were built at Ypres were made by the Germans in early 1915. These were called Mibu, Mannschaft Eisenbeton Unterstand, which, like many German phrases for things they don't have a specific word for, is quite a mouthful, so using the term Mibu, I would guess, was a lot easier even for Fritz himself. And Thurlow notes that the building of concrete structures by the Germans was something that continued at a pace well into 1917. But we now know that there are some bunkers from later periods, later studies of concrete structures show that the Germans were building them right up towards the end of the conflict. And one of the key years in Flanders for the construction of pillboxes was 1916. It's kind of that midway point between those 2 years of static warfare, from the end of the Second Battle of Ypres in May 1915 through to the beginning of the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. And in that year of 1916, when the fighting on the Western Front was at Verdun or down on the Somme, then for the Germans, the Flanders front was a quiet sector. There was no major battles going on there, and they had an opportunity to construct concrete pillboxes and shelters and everything else on a big scale, and that's exactly what you see them doing. The original purpose behind pillboxes was to protect troops, so construct a concrete structure that men could shelter in, whether that was infantry platoons, whether that was machine gunners, whether that was signallers or medics or headquarters staff. It was a way to protect your men rather than being a method or an object which you could use to fight an enemy by creating a defensive position. That came about when the front lines began to and fro, and the Germans realised the importance. If their policy, particularly in Ypres during that long period of static trench warfare, was to defend that ground and deny the Allies the ability to throw them off of it, they needed every type of defensive position that they could muster, and concrete created ones were all part of that arsenal of defence. So bunkers, pillboxes were built for machine guns, for trench mortars, and even artillery. So that widespread use of them to shelter men was still an important part of their construction and why they were placed at different points on the battlefield, but to give them the ability to place weapons within them so that they could be used as defensive points and then link them up so that machine guns in one bunker had interlocking fields of fire with machine guns in another bunker, and that you had a little bit behind them a bunker with a trench mortar, a Minenwerfer in it that could lay down localized mortar fire onto enemy positions or onto enemy attacks. And then further back, as the war progressed, the enemy could see locations behind the lines from the air, from balloons, from air photographs. You could then use the concrete bunkers to protect your field guns and even your heavy guns in those areas. So even if the enemy ascertained that you had field batteries operating in a given part of the battlefield behind your lines, you could protect the guns from counter battery fire by constructing bunkers to place them in. So it all became part of the Germans' philosophy of defence, not just in Flanders, right along the Western Front, but particularly in Flanders, and particularly in northern France too, on the so-called Forgotten Front, where even more bunkers were built there. Something like 2,000 to 2,500 were constructed between Armentières and La Bassée, for example, but we don't have a specific guidebook that looks at them as yet. The bunkers on the German side were constructed by pioneers, and even civil engineers were brought from Germany to construct them as well. And Thurlow notes in the book that ferro-concrete was used from the very first in preference to plain concrete, but to begin with, the reinforcement was not entirely satisfactory. Steel joists, screw pickets, and any kind of scrap iron were thrown in and buried in the concrete. Later, this form of construction gave place to 5/8-inch round iron rods, uniformly distributed over the whole structure, as it was found that the vibrations in girders, rails, screw pickets, etc., had a more disturbing effect on the mass of concrete than the vibrations in the rods. The front walls and roofs of the shelters were from 2.5 to 3 feet thick, and the surrounding earth was heaped up to a thickness of from 7 to 15 feet. So that we can see from that description of how these things were constructed that they gave quite a lot of protection even from the huge amount of artillery that was being used. They weren't completely shell-proof. Later on in the war, methods were developed by the Royal Garrison Artillery, the big guns on the British sector of the Western Front, to bunker bust, to crack open these pillboxes and destroy them. But in that early period, they gave a lot of protection, and they were formidable defensive positions on any part of a battlefield. Initially, the Germans used material for the construction of the concrete from local sources within Belgium itself, particularly the timber, a lot of which came from the Ardennes, the timber for the shuttering for the concrete. But increasingly, they looked for higher and higher grade material, and they shipped it in from Germany along the Rhine, through Holland, and then via the Meuse and the Scheldt rivers. Now, Holland, the Netherlands, was a neutral country, but there was evidence during the war of the shipment of goods and war material through Holland to the Germans as part of their war effort, something that was investigated to a certain degree afterwards. And the whole use of German concrete led to quite a few kind of barrack room stories on the parts of British soldiers. I remember Jock Gaffron, who was a Gordon Highlander in the 51st Highland Division, describing how when they went into the dugouts, the concrete-lined dugouts at the Wye Ravine at Beaumont Hamel in November 1916, they found them concrete-lined, and then evidence of the bags that the concrete had come up in lying on the floor, and when they turned them over to have a look at them, it was a British concrete company, and those had been shipped via Holland to Germany to supply them with high-grade concrete. Now, who knows if that is entirely true, but I think it's all part of how pillboxes loomed largely in the minds of British soldiers because they encountered them so often on the battlefields. The British began to construct concrete structures as well, particularly in parts of the front, like the Forgotten Front, like Flanders, where the line went static for a long time. We used Royal Engineers generally to construct those, or in some cases, some pioneer battalions did that work. In Empire forces, Canadian engineers, Canadian tunnellers, and engineers from other nations like Australia and New Zealand also worked on the bunkers. The Hill 60 bunker that we mentioned was built by Australian engineers, and I can think of the concrete bunker opposite Gomacore on the Somme that was built by New Zealand engineers in 1918. So every part of the British Expeditionary Force that had engineers or pioneers was involved in the construction of their own pillboxes, their own concrete bunkers at different parts of the front, but nowhere near really on the scale of the Germans. And when we look at the types and the size of bunkers, one thing that we notice again by walking the ground and using Thurlow's map, we can see that the bigger bunkers are much further back. There's space there for the bunkers to be constructed. They're away from the eyes of the enemy, whether that's the British or the French or the Belgians, and you've got a place where you can construct a large pillbox, a large bunker for a specific purpose, for artillery, for a headquarters, for signallers, for an aid post, whatever it is. And the nearer you get to the front line, the smaller the bunkers are. So the ones that were very, very close to the forward trenches, they tend to be the smallest. Some of them just tiny little observation posts. If you've seen the German OP at Vimy Ridge, in amongst the mine craters there in the area of preserved trenches, there's a round-shaped German concrete observation post there. That's quite a small concrete structure. So the location of these bunkers on the battlefield was a major influence on their construction, design, purpose, and size. And if we tend to think of the machine gun bunkers, which are the most common types of bunkers that we probably think of when we think of pillboxes of the First World War, bristling with machine guns, firing away, mowing down troops as they try to advance, those tended to be constructed in positions that were not in the very front line but were part of in-depth lines of defence, something that was seen in particular during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917 with the construction of the Flanders lines with this in-depth line of defence which the bunkers were an essential part of. But for the British, though, one of the reasons why they constructed less bunkers than the Germans is the whole philosophy, really, of what the war was about. For a good chunk of the war, Germany was on the defensive. It was fighting defensive battles, holding the Allies at bay, hoping the Allies would throw their men against their lines, lose huge casualties and sue for peace. That was one of the reasons why they dug in the first place when the War of Movement in 1914 came to an end. But the British philosophy was one of attack, was an offensive philosophy, and you can't pick a bunker up and carry it with you into battle. So why waste your energies in terms of manpower and resources in constructing structures that will only be there for a short amount of time? So where you see the larger scale of construction of British bunkers, it's always on parts of the front where there were long periods of static warfare. Flanders, Forgotten Front, and less so in the areas around Arras and on the Hindenburg line and down on the Somme. Another facet of the construction of bunkers was camouflaging them, not necessarily painting camouflage designs on them. Camouflage, a French word, was something that was developed by the French to disguise positions. It was used by the British and used by the Germans throughout the First World War. There was that type of camouflage, but very often bunkers would be hidden by building them in existing buildings. So where there was a farm building or a mill or a tower, you could construct something inside that and use the existing building as a framework around it to give it not protection, but to cover the true purpose of what was inside. So observation posts that were concrete towers built up inside a chimney of a factory, for example. That wasn't uncommon. And then machine gun bunkers built into farm buildings, so it looked as if the farm building was unchanged, but yet inside was a defensive position. And if you go down into the southern part of the Flanders front, right onto the border with France and Belgium, and go behind the German lines in that area, you'll find quite a lot of examples of these, and even more if you continue on into that forgotten front. So Thurlow's work gives us a bit of an insight into the construction, what was placed there, the purpose, the designs and things like that, and then he moves on to what you could find of those bunkers from the Great War on that landscape of the 1920s and 30s. Now, in that post-war period, there were a huge number of these concrete structures right along the Western Front, and in Flanders, as the civilian population began to return, they were something of a nuisance if you're trying to reclaim your land, rebuild your farm, and the Germans have put this big concrete structure right inside where your best barn was located, and the barn's been blown away, and now there's this huge bunker that you can't use for anything. There was a desire to get rid of them. Attempts were made to blow them up, sometimes successfully, but at huge cost. The amount of explosive that was required to destroy them was staggering, considering that they'd been built to withstand huge bombardments, and indeed, in some cases over several years, they had clearly withstood those bombardments because they were here on the landscape when everything else around them had been destroyed. It wasn't going to be an easy task to blow up some of these bunkers, and the cost of it brought that kind of approach to getting rid of them to an end. There was some evidence that they tried to create cavities underneath some of the bunkers, particularly the smaller ones, and collapse the bunker into the cavity and then cover it over. And quite a few bunkers had been constructed at trench level, so they were level with the area of the fields, which meant ploughing that bit of ground was problematic. And in those areas, they either turned it to pasture and left the bunkers, or they covered them over with an extra layer of earth. How successful that was, I really don't know. So perhaps partly what was behind Thurlow's attempt to write this book, to publish this book, was him seeing how bunkers had disappeared. Perhaps if he began to survey them in the 1920s, within a decade, he will have seen some completely gone. And even at the point in which he's writing this book, battlefield tourism has moved from the difficult period of Ypres being a bit of a kind of shanty town, almost a bit like the Wild West in the early 1920s. It's risen like this phoenix from the ashes. The city's been reconstructed. There are proper hotels there rather than wooden hotels, and there's a whole network of tourism with battlefield tours and battlefield guides and publications. But it's still tricky, perhaps, for the interwar visitor to find places that are outside the area of the main tours, from Essex Farm up to Tynecott down into the Menin Gates. And with Thurlow's numbering of the bunkers, we see that he comes across dozens of bunkers rather than hundreds or thousands of bunkers. He doesn't catalogue them all. There's quite a lot that we know of now that he missed for whatever reason or wasn't aware of. But it's an interesting kind of snapshot, really, of what was there at that time and what was considered important to those interwar battlefield pilgrims. So it's all part of that story beyond the First World War that authors like Mark Connolly and Roger Stewart, both of whom we've had on the podcast, are very keen for us to know about, and it is an important part of our understanding of the wider aspects of the Great War. So given that we have Thurlow's book as a starting point, what can we find of the pillboxes of Flanders on the battlefield today? In this part of the podcast, we'll kind of do a Pillboxes of Flanders in a day, where we'll travel around a bit of the battlefields in the area of Ypres, and we'll see some of the bunkers that we can find on the landscape today. I'm not going to replicate what is in Thurlow's book because he doesn't cover them all, and there's quite a few interesting ones that he doesn't mention that are well worth going to see to get an idea of the scope and size and shape and number of pillboxes that there are in this area of Flanders. So what this is not is a catalogue of all of the bunkers. If you're looking for that, and I don't think there is any publication that literally lists them all, but a good starting point is Peter Oldham's Armageddon's Walls, which doesn't just cover Ypres, covers the whole of the British sector of the Western Front, and I'll put a link to that onto the podcast website as well. There'll be a map on the podcast website, a Google map, so you can find these different locations. And what we're about to look at is a mix of well-known bunkers perhaps, and perhaps lesser-known bunkers as well. And one thing that I will mention is do always respect private land, because quite a lot of these bunkers are not in public spaces, and it means that if you want to go right up close to them or get into them, you've got to find a landowner and get permission to do that. You can stand back and look at them, but the Great War, the history of the Great War, sits side by side with the modern world and the modern landscape, and we always need to remember that and respect it. So let's begin our tour in the northern area of the Ypres battlefields, northeast of Bosinger at the Ziegler bunker. The Ziegler bunker is quite a substantial concrete structure. It's about 20 metres long and about 6 metres wide, and it was built by the Germans sometime in the 1915-16 period, possibly named after the officer who supervised the construction of the bunker. It was located in what was then a wooded area behind the German front line, where at that point their forward positions would have faced Belgian troops. This was at the close join between the British and the Belgian lines in that sector around Bosinger. Later on in the fighting, the French would attack from those positions on the 31st of July 1917, on the opening day of the Third Battle of Ypres, and French troops would actually roll up this ground and capture the Ziegler bunker in that opening day of Third Ypres, not British troops who are a little bit further to the south, where the Guards and the 38th Welsh Division attacked. The bunker's often called the Viking ship simply because of its size and shape. It looks a little bit like a ship. I think that's more of a recent name from it than a contemporary one. But what we've got here is a headquarters bunker constructed away from the main area. As we were saying earlier, these bigger bunkers tend to be built further back from the front line. You need space, you need cover, you need an area to construct them. And this was built as a headquarters. There's what the Germans called a Blinkstelle at the back of it, which is a design within the concrete structure where you could put a lamp, and electric powered lamp, which you could use to signal back to a signal relay station. So a German signaller inside with a powerful lamp could morse back a message from the headquarters in the bunker to the relay post that then could be delivered to a headquarters further back. It's also got an area where there were pigeons in the bunker that carried messages, and the pigeons could be released from that part of the bunker as well. So we could describe it more as a signals and communications bunker than a defensive bunker built as part of a defensive line, although its headquarters nature meant that it was conducting and overseeing and controlling the units that were on that part of the front. And in the fighting on the 31st of July 1917, the French troops attacked from the area of the Ypres Canal through the German lines in this area on the flanks of the main British advance. The French attack during Third Ypres is often forgotten, and it was a successful day for them, as was most part of the British attack on that day in 1917, not without loss on their part, but generally most objectives were taken. In this area, this part of the ground was captured. And later on, when the British came into this area, Royal Engineer units then took over the bunker. These bunkers were often reused when captured. You had former entrances that now faced the enemy, so that was something that had to be sorted out. You had to often put a cover around the entrance to protect soldiers so that a shell didn't come straight through the front door from the German side and wipe out everybody inside. Sadly, that did happen with quite a few bunkers that were captured, particularly in 1917, and often they would adapt them for whatever use that was going on. So Royal Engineer units did some adaptations to this, and then it fell to the Germans again in 1918, when in April of that year, during what was called the Battle of the Lys by the British, the Germans attacked from Passchendaele and pushed the British right back to the very edge of Ypres, and this ground was taken once more. And the position finally recaptured, finally liberated, if you like, by Belgian troops in the Fourth Battle of Ypres in September of 1918. So we've got a large and important bunker here that gives us a good insight into what types of bunkers that the Germans were building in this mid-war period. It is on private land, so you can't hop over the fence and walk up to it and go inside. I think there have been one or two open days over the years, and hopefully that's something that might continue. But just standing there on the road and looking at it and photographing it from different angles, you can get a real sense of it on the landscape and how important it would have been to the German control and command in this area of the northern part of the Ypres salient. We'll stay in the Bösinger area now and we'll travel over to Gumier Farm. There's a large German bunker here. The farm, Gumier Farm, was named after French colonial cavalry soldiers who were here in 1915. And in 1917, during the opening stage of the Third Battle of Ypres, it was in an area that was on the join between the attack of the 38th Welsh Division over the Pilkelm Ridge and the 51st Highland Division on their flanks over their sector of the Pilkelm Ridge, advancing towards the Steenbeek River. In the Welsh Division area, there was a lot of opposition from German defenders in concrete structures. What they found was that the Germans built not just bunkers like the one that we're looking at here, but quite a number of structures within farm buildings. So they concreted existing buildings and turned them into defensive posts as well. And while the Guards Division attacked just to the north of them and did well in their advance towards the river, the Steenbeek, the Welsh Division was slowed down in their advance because of all these defensive positions. And Gumier Farm was one of those that caused problems for them and also the neighbouring Scottish troops. Now, the bunker is also on private land, but can often be walked up to by walking along the edge of the field. Obviously, don't walk across crops or anything like that. Farmers pretty friendly in this area. And you'll see that it was another bunker that was taken over by the British and then reused. The Royal Engineers placed protective sections of concrete around the original German entrances to shield off any shell fire that would come in and kill or injure any occupants of the bunker. So there's some later adaptations by the Royal Engineers. There's also a plaque on the bunker, a grey slate plaque, Welsh slate, that was placed there, I believe, in either the 60s or the 70s by a group of Welsh veterans to commemorate their comrades who fell in this part of the battlefield. Now, perhaps they chose the bunker as an obvious place that overlooked the grounds where the Welsh Division had attacked, because it seems from looking at the records that this bunker was in fact captured by the 6th Battalion of the Black Watch from the Highland Division on the 31st of July 1917, not by men from the South Wales Borderers or the Welsh Regiment or the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. They were advancing slightly to the north. But it appears that machine guns from this area troubled both formations. And what you see with bunkers like this, which was almost certainly constructed, again, like the Ziegler bunker as a headquarters bunker, is the Germans putting machine guns up on the roof of these bunkers and firing from an elevated position to lay down saturation fire, area fire into a given part of the battlefield to slow down an advance. And that is what we see in this part of the story of the attack on the Pilkelm Ridge on the 31st of July 1917. So we've had two headquarters bunkers built by the Germans. We're now going to go over to the Ypres Canal itself, close to the lock at Bösinger, just to the south of where the old railway bridge is. And there's a bunker that is built into the area where the towpath is now. I think there's even a little bench alongside it where you can sit. And this is a bunker that was built by the British in 1917, some months before the big attack here as part of the opening stage of 3rd Ypres. Built right into a trench system that was here on the edge of the canal. The trenches stopped on the far side of the canal, close to what was called International Trench, beyond that Yorkshire Trench, which some of you may have visited. And they then continued on this side of the canal, following the edge of it up towards the railway bridge, which was dropped into the water of the canal, up towards where the road bridge was. That too dropped into the canal. And then beyond that was where that line of demarcation was between the British and the Belgian or the French forces, depending on what part of the war it was. So this is a much smaller bunker. At some periods of the year, it's covered in grass and weeds and very difficult to notice that it's even there. And it's typical of a front line bunker built overlooking an enemy position that had to be done not quite in secret, but had to be done carefully, so not as to arouse the attention of the Germans on the other side. And if they had noticed it, of course, they would have bombarded hell's bells out of it to try and stop that work from going on. So this is a small observation bunker, not a machine gun or a sniper's bunker or anything like that. It's to give an advantage to someone inside to be protected, to have a clear field of vision towards the German positions, probably looking straight down the middle of no man's land where the canal was in one direction, and then straight down the middle of no man's land in the other direction beyond International Trench. And this is typical, as I say, of the kind of small observation bunkers that were built in the very front line. We'll then continue down the Ypres Canal to a much visited part of the battlefields today, probably right back to the 20s and 30s. It was exactly the same, and that is the Essex Farm bunkers. Now, these are not observation bunkers or headquarters or defensive bunkers. They're from a medical facility that was here, an advanced dressing station in this case, that was established on this site in 1915 by British troops and then Canadian troops. Colonel John McCrae, serving then during the Second Battle of Ypres, was here. And this is where he wrote the famous poem In Flanders Fields. We've talked about this in a previous episode of the podcast. But we've come here to see another type of bunker. And Essex Farm is the surviving example of a dressing station bunker, where we've got a multi-chambered bunker structure where each room served a different purpose. They would clean and dress wounds undercover, out of the rain, out of the shell fire in one part of it. There would be walking wounded casualties in another one, medical personnel in another one, stretchers and equipment in another part of the bunker. So each of these different rooms and chambers has its own purpose, its own function, and then they've opened it up now so you can walk along it. There are some further concrete structures just beyond the main dressing station bunker itself that served as the headquarters and the personnel that were billeted there. This is where they sheltered too. So it's quite a big complex, and it's one of a number of dressing stations that were built into the bank of the Ypres Canal, this old medieval canal. When it was constructed in medieval times, the spoil from digging the canal was thrown up as the canal bank, and in the First World War, British, French originally, but certainly British troops dug into this, and they created defensive positions, artillery positions, headquarters, and these dressing station bunkers as well. Just down the road was the Duhallow Advanced Dressing Station, where there is a cemetery of that name now, and there are some wartime images of the dressing station bunker there. Not dissimilar to this, not quite the same design. Both of them built by the Royal Engineers, possibly the Royal Engineers of the 39th Division in late 1916 when they'd moved up from the Somme. But the Duhallow bunkers, which do appear to have survived into the 20s and 30s, disappeared sometime in the post-World War II period, and there's a modern housing estate on the ground where the Duhallow dressing station was located, so no trace of it at ground level. Perhaps a few of those people have some concrete structures that are their tool sheds in their gardens. That again is kind of an example of how the historical landscape sits side by side with the modern landscape. So we've seen German command and headquarters bunkers. We've looked at a frontline observation bunker. We've come here to a dressing station bunker, and we're going to continue now and go over to the ground near to Saint-Julien to the Cheddar Villa bunker, which was part of the German defences in that area of the Pilkelm Ridge and close to the Steenbeck River, which was just the other side of the village of Saint-Julien from there. This is a very large bunker. It's tucked away in a farm complex now. Again, it's a working farm. You can't just wander in there. You can approach the farmer and ask permission to have a look at it. The times that I've been in there, he's kept his cows in there and various farming equipment. It's got a very large aperture, this bunker, and I guess that they planned and perhaps did have a field gun in there to fire over open sights at any advancing enemy. Possibly the field gun was placed there to take on any tanks, because this was a period, of course, in which tanks were very much part of the battlefield landscape, and it was clear from the earlier experiences on the Somme and Arras that tanks could be knocked out by direct fire from field guns, and perhaps the Germans planned to do the same thing with this bunker here. It was captured in the early stages of the attack on the 31st of July 1917 by units of the 39th Division, and there's quite a good little extract in Thurlow about it, which I'll read for you now. Cheddar Villa, a large concrete work, still in a fair state of preservation, was made considerable use of by British troops after its capture on the 31st of July 1917. It became a regimental aid post and subsequently a battalion headquarters of the 1st, 4th Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Its situation on the crest of a ridge permitted of a very fair view of the surrounding country, but as was the case with so many of the German blockhouses, it had a particularly wide entrance which, when in British hands, was completely exposed to enemy shells. On the night of the 7th-8th of August 1917, a platoon of the 1st Buckinghamshire Battalion was sheltering inside the opening, trying to obtain much-needed rest. The very first shell which landed near the blockhouse burst in the midst of the slumbering platoon. The effect was disastrous. Many were killed, and of those who were not killed, several lost limbs. Fortunately, one of the very few who escaped was the regimental medical officer. So this is a bunker that saw fighting, was captured by assaulting troops, reused by the British, and was sadly a place which cost them casualties as well. And in this area there's quite a few stories of this. Just down the road was the Van Heuler bunker, which was hit by a high velocity shell on the 31st of July, possibly in the early hours of the 1st of August 1917, when it was being used as the aid post of the 13th Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment. They were the South Downs battalions, and Albert Banfield, who I knew was a veteran of that unit, who remembered that incident when the battalion stretcher bearers suffered such heavy casualties when the aid post was knocked out. And one of those who was killed there was Leonard West, whose military medal I have. He got it for bringing in the wounded under fire at the Boar's Head at Richbourg in June of 1916, only to be killed at that Van Heuler bunker just down the road from where we are at Cheddar Villa in the opening stage of the Third Battle of Ypres. His name is on the Menin Gate. He's one of those I always try and visit every time I go to the Menin Gate for the last post. So from St Julian we'll cut across and we'll go back over no man's land to the pre-1917 front line positions, and we'll follow that old front line, the curve of the Ypres salient, from that static period of trench warfare from mid-1915 to mid-1917, past villages like Wiltshire, across to St Jan and Portesa, and just the other side of Portesa as you move towards Hellfire Corner on the Menin Road, we come to Hussar Farm. Now we're in an area where dismounted cavalry soldiers fought during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, which is why this farm is named after the Hussars. But in the original farm buildings, as part of the original farm buildings, they constructed a concrete observation post. It appears to have been done by pioneers and by men of the Royal Field Artillery themselves. Possibly that was quite unusual. Most of these structures were built by engineers, but this one appears, according to Peter Oldham anyway, to have been built by the artillery itself. And it's an observation post, a bunker built up into a fairly tall building whose height gave the occupants of the observation post a very good view over the ridges here, to the Pilkelm Ridge to their left, to the Frasenberg Ridge straight ahead of them, and to the Bellewaerde Ridge over to their right. So this is not a defensive bunker or a command headquarters bunker. It's an observation post set back from the front line area. The front line's about 3/4 of a mile or so from where this bunker was constructed, to give the gunner officers, the FOOs, the forward observation officers, a view over the ground to direct their artillery fire. And it was used for that purpose from 1916, when it was constructed, through to the end of the conflict. Again, it's on private ground, it's within a working farm, but you can stand there and photograph it. I've been up to the bunker on a couple of occasions, never been in it. The family there are very friendly, but obviously again we have to respect their privacy and that this is their home. And there are one or two wartime photographs of the bunker as well, showing the state it was in, and there's a picture of it in Thurlow's book, which I'll put onto the podcast website so you can see that. Now this is a British bit of concrete constructed in that long period of trench warfare where the lines were not moving at all in this sector, and surrounding it, and a lot of the farms and the larger buildings in this area are other types of British bunkers. Some of them built up above ground level, curved kind of Nissen hut shaped bunkers. that were used as signals posts or headquarters positions. There are small squat bunkers in some of the buildings. Most of these now are almost invisible. They're tucked away within modern buildings, houses and farms, no longer visible from public roads or public footpaths. And I've only noticed them by walking and visiting this area for so many years. When you used to be able to walk up the old railway line before it was a road, you could see some of these bunkers then. They're not as visible as they were now, but it's part of a network. And again, as we said, the British only really constructed concrete structures when they were faced with long periods of static warfare and fronts where the front lines just did not move. And of course, that was exactly what happened here around St Jan and Wiltshire and Portesa and the sector around the Menin Road for a big chunk of the First World War. From Hussar Farm, we'll go down to Hellfire Corner, we'll go up the Menin Road, up over the Menin Road Ridge to Gelleveld, to the Gelleveld Plateau, and drop down to Zandvoorde, just the other side of the village. As we drop away to the grounds beyond Zandvoorde, on the right-hand side is quite a large German bunker. Now, this is a really interesting one. It's in very good condition. There are known wartime photographs of it, which are on display here, and it still retains the original wartime plaque placed in concrete on the side of the bunker denoting who built them. These were very common with German structures. Normally they were very proud of the work they'd done to construct these pillboxes, and they put a little plaque up saying which unit had built it. In this case, when we look at it, it says it was built by the 3rd Company of the 27th Armierungsbattalion. That was the 27th Reinforcements Battalion. They built this in 1916. And it's a multi-chambered headquarters bunker, then quite some way behind the front line. There are a lot of heavy gun artillery positions in this area, giving protective fire to the front line areas around the Menin Road, at Hoog, and to the south of there on Hill 62, Observatory Ridge, and that kind of sector close to Sanctuary Wood. And likely also used as a regimental headquarters for a German regiment that was occupying that part of the front. So a German regiment was the size of a British brigade, and it would have had multiple battalions serving in the front line area, and this would have been its main command and control centre. So built for potentially a number of different purposes depending on who was operating in this part of the battlefield. Eventually captured by British troops in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917 towards the end of that battle, and not badly damaged in that fighting. Today, this is a site that for many years was just covered over and not accessible, but has been opened up, and you can actually go into the bunker and walk around it and get a very good idea of what these concrete structures were like. So this should be very much at the top of your bunker list when you're coming to have a look at these pillboxes of Flanders. From there, we'll go back down the Menin Road to Hellfire Corner to head to the southern part of the Ypres salient. Coming away from Hellfire Corner, there's a small British bunker on the right-hand side that was built later in the war. This was a main route up to the front line. There was a wooden trackway built on the old railway line here, and in this little dell, this little hollow, troops were assembled by the traffic control, the foot police that were here controlling Hellfire Corner, to be then sent safely across Hellfire Corner up the Menin Road or into the communication trenches, whichever route they were going. And the bunker may have been built for them. It also may relate to the later use of this ground following the beginning of the Third Battle of Ypres, pushing the Germans back, when this was an area a little bit further behind the British front line, when the railway was re-established and railway troops were operating in this area, and the bunker may well have been used by them. But continuing past there and heading down the road that goes right across the top of the Messines Ridge via Saint-Éloi and Witcharter, there are bunkers in all of these areas, so many of them, we can't possibly cover them all in this one podcast. But we're heading down to Messines itself, the town that gives the ridge its name, to the New Zealand Memorial Park there, where we've got two very good examples of German bunkers that were part of the defensive line along the Messines Ridge, typical of the German bunkers constructed by the Germans in that mid-war period, 1916 period, when they put in positions like this that were defensive bunkers that enabled machine gun crews to be sheltered within the bunker and then bring their weapons up and use concrete fire steps to set the weapon up onto the top of the bunker and fire down onto any Allied troops that were operating in this area or trying to advance up this slope. And one of the great things about this particular location is you can see the dominance of the Messines Ridge, the view from here right across this landscape towards the villages that were behind the lines, Wolvergem. You can see beyond that, on a very clear day, the spires of Balliol in northern France, which is the main town behind the lines in this sector. To your left, in the very far distance, are the twin slag heaps of the double Crassier near Luz, and beyond that, of course, Vimy Ridge. So it's a very dominant position, and you can see why these types of machine gun defensive bunkers were built here to protect this part of the German line and enable the defenders to employ their machine guns with potentially devastating effect. And in 1917, we see how the war has changed. If this had been a year before on the Somme, then these bunkers could have played merry hell in no man's land, and the New Zealand soldiers who attacked here in 1917 could have been mown down. But the war was very different. The barrage that protected them as they moved across that open ground suppressed the Germans at the same time, enabling the New Zealanders to get right up close and into these positions and overwhelm them before the Germans had a chance to react. So eventually, despite all these concrete structures being built, despite them being placed often in critical locations like this that gave them huge advantage, the way the war was fought eventually came up with ways of overcoming all this and making this kind of static defence eventually redundant. And 1917 saw a move in the war away from static warfare to a war of mobility, and bunkers are part of static defences. As we said before, they can't be picked up and moved about. And although bunkers continue to play an important role on the battlefield in all of the battles that were fought in 1917-18, particularly on the Hindenburg line where the Germans are constructed even more, the changing nature of the way the war was fought enabled troops on the ground to overcome them as obstacles. So they were not the great fear that perhaps they might have once been. But here on the Messines Ridge, I think this is a good place to end our little journey, looking at these pillboxes of Flanders, these bunkers, these concrete structures that today, as we look at the wider landscape of the Western Front, they kind of stand almost like monoliths to the fighting, to the battles of more than a century ago. Just like the cemeteries, just like the memorials, they too are beacons to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.